Anyway, this is a talk that I haven't given in a while, a few years, but I thought it might be something that would be of interest in a group like this. Of course, focusing a lot on tropical environments and ecology at JCU. So this is the title of this talk. Is referring to a living laboratory, which is a phrase that's been used to describe the so-called biological dynamics of forest fragments project, which we'll talk about some more. But this is in the central Amazon, and it's one of the really productive research projects that have been operating over the years. Anyway, when we talk about different areas of tropical forests around the world, we realize that there are different drivers that are causing lots of deforestation in those regions. In the Amazon, the biggest cause is cattle ranching. Lots and lots of forests being knocked down, fragmented for cattle ranching. The other big land use that's growing very fast is soybeans or soy production, industrial soy production, as you can see down here. And then also there's various other land uses. Oil palm is starting to get hold more and more in the Amazon. Logging, timber production has been a big issue there for many times. Of course, there's also smaller scale swidden farming, like we see in many parts of the world, slash and burn farming. But the big ones are cattle ranching and soy production. And then I think timber, with all the roads that are being produced by those logging companies and logging projects is really promoting the destruction of forests. And so another big thing that's happening in the Amazon, and there's been sort of a landslide of investment coming in, particularly from outside and particularly from China, in particular as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. But suddenly now there are, well, not suddenly, because there have been major road projects all through the Amazon for many years, and it's been an enormous concern because these roads sort of open up the forest like a flayed fish and allow illegal loggers and land grabbers and poachers and illegal miners and others to invade in these forests and impact on the indigenous peoples that live there. So the roads thing is a really big issue, and it's something that's just sort of exploding in the Amazon. This is a paper we actually published a long time ago, in 2001, in Science, but it was basically asking if all the projects that had been proposed at that time actually went ahead, and these were like roads, power lines, gas lines, hydroelectric dams, lots of big infrastructure projects, which were designed to, they were hoping would stimulate, thousands of extractive industry projects around the world, so timber, mining, other types of things, oil and gas. But anyway, so we asked, what would happen to the Amazon if all those projects went ahead? And we came up with two scenarios. The one on top is a so-called optimistic scenario, and the one on the bottom is a so-called pessimistic scenario. But the bottom line is this: neither one of them look very good, and this is the world's largest surviving tract of tropical forest. And I think one thing that really shocked people was not just that there would be more deforestation, but that the Amazon would be getting fragmented on a basin-wide scale. And we know that those fragments, those patches, isolated patches of forest, are much more vulnerable to predatory logging, to wildfires, to global change phenomena. So all of this stuff is of significant concern. Now, this is the biological dynamics of forest projects I mentioned. It's about a 2-hour drive north of Manaus in the central Amazon. It was initiated in 1979. For many years, it was operated by Brazil's National Institute for Amazonian Research, which is called INPA, Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas da Amazonia, and STRI, which is the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which is where Sue and I ended up being based for a number of additional years. Now, STRI has since dropped out of that picture, I think very unfortunately. In fact, the decision from STRI to reduce a lot of its support for the project is one of the main reasons I was interested in leaving STRI, because I was that unhappy about seeing this project defunded. Anyway, one of the things that's really an advantage of this type of study, and sorry, these areas here are all cleared, so these are cattle pastures here, and this is an experimental forest fragmentation study. You've got fragments in here ranging from 1 to 100 hectares in area, the dark areas, the black areas, and the areas in the intact forest, which is the white areas here, these are experimental controls outside of the fragments. So, and these areas here have cattle pastures, and they also have some regrowth forest in them. So anyway, a big advantage of this project is you can imagine if you do a fragmentation study, many people go out and they study some intact forest areas, and they call these experimental controls, and then they study some fragments, and they say, what's the difference between the two? But there could be lots of reasons for those differences, aside from just the fragmentation effects. We just want to know what forest fragmentation is causing, not complicated by everything else. So having these pre-fragmentation censuses of trees, vines, birds, lots of different insect groups, I mean, on and on and on, primates, all kinds of things, is an enormous advantage. This study is also kind of a pure experiment in the sense that in the real world, if you go out into fragmented landscapes in the Amazon, you'll see that the fragments they're not just fragmented, they're being hunted, they're being burned by various reasons, by cattle ranchers. There's all kinds that are being logged, selectively logged. So all these additional impacts kind of compound the effects of fragmentation, but in this system, it would have been incredibly complicated to try to incorporate all that. So basically, this just focuses on fragmentation without getting into these other things. And the fragments are even fenced to prevent cattle from getting into the fragments. So bottom line is this is set up as a pretty nice experiment. It has its critics, other things people think it should be doing, and it's not, but it is doing a lot of stuff. This is the guy who founded the project, Tom Lovejoy. We've worked with Tom for many years. Sadly, Tom died about a year ago, and he was instrumental in a lot of things, but the Fragmentation project was really his baby through the years, and he came in many times, and particularly in terms of fundraising. Tom was instrumental in terms of raising funding for the project, and I'm not sure what's going to happen to the Fragmentation project now without him fundraising like it is. Okay, so the work that Susan, Laurance, and I were involved in a lot was the botanical side of the project, particularly looking at trees and lianas. We had a total of 69 1-hectare plots monitored since the early 1980s. And you can see here there was big trees, big tree is greater than 10 centimeters in diameter, about 4 inches. Smaller trees, which are less than that, and lianas, which are, of course, woody vines. And then there's also been a lot of work on the matrix, not that we did that. And also Forest Geo, which is a subset of the Smithsonian, has a 25-hectare plot there. We just worked in 1-hectare plots. They have a much bigger 25-hectare plot that they're studying. So there's a lot of stuff going on sort of botanically, particularly in this sort of part of the Amazon that's not very well known relative to a lot of other areas of the tropics. The herbarium, again, this is an area where Sue Laurance was very much involved along with a lady there, Anna Andrade. You can see here that the species richness of this area is really high. You can compare this. If we look at the number of trees greater than 10 centimeters diameter at Barro Colorado Island in Panama and at La Selva in Costa Rica, you can see here we're getting, 80, 90, 70, 80, 90 species per hectare greater than that size. If we look at the Amazon, we're getting close to 300 species per hectare. And that's averaged over a whole bunch of plots. That's not some wild, unrepresentative value. That's the average across a very large study area. So heaps and heaps of species, and it's enough to drive anybody just about mad when you're trying to figure out what's happening with forest fragmentation, because you want to know how are species changing and what's shifting and all these are dynamics changing. But first thing, you got to know what you're looking at, and it really is a challenge to try to grapple with that. So people who study fragmentation, habitat fragmentation, sometimes call themselves fragmentologists. Fragmentologists will sometimes talk about the different kinds of phenomena that might affect ecosystems, fragmented ecosystems. So one thing would be like area effects. So that would be, if we're talking about area effects, that means if a fragment's really small, then the area effects would be really severe, right? The really severe constraints on those populations and survival. If it's really big, then we wouldn't expect the area effects to be so strong. Isolation and connectivity, we know that a fragment, if it's connected to forest, is going to be quite different than if it's isolated. The landscape will influence the connectivity. Edge effects, which are ecological changes happening around the borders of the fragments. This is going to be a big part of our story, as you'll see. And also matrix effects. The matrix, it's not like a movie starring Keanu Reeves. The matrix in fragmentation parlance is all that modified land that surround fragments. Okay, so that's the pastures and croplands and secondary growth and log forest, whatever it is that surrounds the fragment. And so when we talk about matrix effects, we think that those lands surrounding the fragments might be quite important. Now, one of the things this study has really cemented, I think, is an appreciation of just how important edge effects are and how diverse they are and how complex they can be. This is showing data right here from different studies that have been conducted at the Forest Fragmentations Project. So that's 0 meters right there. That would be the forest edge, and that's like cattle pasture out here. And then this is going hundreds of meters into the forest interior. And you can just stare at that for a second and realize the incredible diversity of physical and biological edge phenomena that are happening there. You've got invasions of non-forest species, you've got changes in forest dynamics, you've got shifts in community composition. Really, there's just all kinds of things and affecting all aspects, almost from the roots all the way up to the treetops. There's something being affected by these edge phenomena. One of the phenomena that's pretty conspicuous is the elevated tree mortality. We see a lot of death and damage of trees in these forest fragments. This again is looking at a plot. You'll see a few of these plots here where you'll get the edge right here. So again, that's might be cattle pastures or second growth out here. And then this is moving into the interior of the forest. In this case though, I've log transformed this axis. So that's like 1 meter right there, or 100 meters, 0 meters right there, excuse me. And then that's 1,000 meters. That's 100 meters, 1,000, and then that right there would be about 3,000 meters, just so you know. So it's just looking at it with what's called a log transformed axis. Bottom line is when we get close to the edge, we get a lot of dead trees. What's happening? Well, we think that wind shear is important. When you denude the vegetation around these fragments, the winds can build up and they slam into the sides of the fragments and they topple trees over and they snap them in half. Another thing is that there's a lot of microclimatic stresses. The rainforest is dense and humid and almost windless and very dark. Outside the pasture, it's bright and hot and highly variable temperatures and much lower humidity and really harsh microclimatic conditions. So you juxtapose, this harsh cattle pasture with this benign rainforest environment, and those environmental conditions move back and forth, and you get these kinds of changes happening. So the edge effects really do appear to be quite important. The matrix itself also influences the edge effects, and this is kind of logical if you think about it. If you have a fragment that's just surrounded by cattle pastures, and imagine another forest fragment that's surrounded by, say, regrowth forest, might be 10 meters tall, something like that. The one with the regrowth forest does not get damaged as much. That secondary vegetation, the regrowth, is providing a partial buffer on the forest edges. It's helping to reduce that. So you can see here with these curves, there's the different distances to the forest edge. Here's the mortality rate for the trees. And you can see here, if you're surrounded by cattle pasture, you just get more dead trees. And if you've got regrowth forest, then you get lower numbers of dead trees. So the regrowth can sort of provide a buffer if it's there. The matrix that we talked about, there are different types of matrices. Again, we can have a matrix that, a type of vegetation like cattle pasture, or we might have something that's what we would call a Vismia-dominated matrix, which is dominated by a particular type of tree called Vismia. And there's also a Cecropia-dominated tree, which is also dominated by Cecropia. Those are quite different. Vismia comes in if you burn the forest after you cut it down. Cecropia comes in if you don't burn the forest after you cut it down. But the bottom line is this: if we look at forest fragments and we look at the seeds that are coming in, that the bats and the birds are bringing in and depositing in these disturbed forests, which is these seeds are the future of the forest. This is the future of the rainforest. We see that there's a real big difference between the two different types of regrowth, okay? If you're surrounded by Cecropia regrowth, you're gonna get a lot of Cecropia seeds, and you're gonna get a lot of Cecropia regeneration in the fragment as the fragment's floristic composition shifts over time as a consequence of this. So those are some of the things that the matrix can do, and fragmentation in general, this is not just talking about trees, but just generally, can do three major things to the rainforest systems. One is that it can disrupt forest architecture. So just the basic structure of the forest, and you can see here, this is some satellite imagery of a fragmentation project, and you can see here there are a lot of tree fall gaps. There's a lot of forest disturbance. And in rainforest systems, when you get recurring disturbances, this is what a rainforest looks like when you basically have an intact canopy and not much disturbance. And this is what it looks like when you get repeated disturbances. You get light-loving plants and invasive type species and a whole set of things, but the microclimatic and structure and dynamics and composition can all be really quite different. So that's one thing that can happen. This is sort of an analysis that shows this going on. So what we have here is we're looking at the same sets of forest plots over a 20-year period or 25-year period. And we're asking, well, how did the structure of those tree communities change over time? So this might be right after forest fragmentation and then maybe 25 years later, okay? Well, what we see is that the plots that are right in the forest, that are deep in the forest interior, these are different size categories of trees here. So you can small trees, 10 to 20 centimeters, 20 to 30, et cetera, on up to greater than 60 centimeters. So that's getting to be a pretty big tree for a rainforest. But what you see here is over that 25-year period, this is the percentage change, these green bars, okay? Not much change. Things are pretty stable in the intact forest. We're not getting big shifts in the tree communities in terms of the sizes of the trees. But look at the red plots, the plots near the forest edges. Firstly, we're getting a big increase, this is not surprising at all, we're getting a big increase in the really small trees. Well, everything's gotten really beat up there, And the small trees, they like that disturbance. They like to come in. And look at all these other larger trees. Decline, decline, big decline, decline, decline. So the whole forest is shifting in terms of its structure and its architecture as reflected in those types of changes there. So that's one change in forest structure or architecture. Second is changes in species composition. So what species are actually there in terms of the tree communities. And one of the things that we see is what you might call a compositional breakdown of tree communities. This, again, is looking at our plot with our log transformed axes here. So we have 100 meters, this would be 0 meters there, 1,000 meters, and that's about 3,000 meters. We can see as we're moving closer and closer to the forest edge, we suddenly get a big increase in this thing called Euclidean distance. This measurement, Euclidean distance, is a measure of how dissimilar, how unalike the species are in any two samples, okay? So in this case, we're comparing the tree to the plot to itself, okay? So this is like 25 years, we're comparing the changes after 25 years with what the plot had very much in the beginning, which is a really strong methods experimentally to be able to try to infer things. But the bottom line is this: when you get close to forest edges, things just kind of go chaotic. You suddenly get species just sort of wildly changing in terms of their abundances and this breakdown of compositional similarity. Why? What's happening? Well, one of the things that we know is happening is we're getting this huge increase in pioneer species. So these are things that like light, they hate shade, they like disturbances, they like these kinds of environments. And there are quite a number of these things that are native species in the Amazon, around 52 species altogether. And you can see this, just a massive increase as we're getting closer and closer to forest edges in these pioneer species. And along with that is a decline in the old growth species. Okay, so there are going to be big differences in the biology of pioneers and old growth species. Pioneers are going to be, I won't get into all the differences, but there'll be a lot of ecological differences. And generally speaking, we're not worried about pioneers. It's the old growth things that need the intact forest. Those are the things that we really worry about. And you can see here a negative relationship between the number of succession, or the percentage of trees in successional families and the percentage in old growth families here. So that tells you that if you're going to get a lot of successional trees, you're going to lose some of your old growth trees. So there's also, in addition to this big influx of pioneer species, is a general restructuring of the old growth communities. So the trees that still survive, the old growth trees, are also changing, okay? And the big thing that we're seeing is a large assemblage of species that we just broadly call the losers. And these are smaller subcanopy trees, which are generally less than, say, 20 meters tall. They like shade, they're not light loving at all, and they don't like disturbed environments. They grow very slowly, they have very dense wood, they just have a whole set of things that makes them adapted for intact rainforests. And they also need animal seed dispersers, the really vulnerable ones, and they have obligate outbreeding, because with some plants can just inbreed really heavily and it doesn't bother them. Some plants can even breed with themselves and it doesn't bother them. But most inbreeding is a problem. And so these guys have to have obligate outbreeding. So they grow slowly, they're shade specialists, and they're poorly adapted for disturbed conditions like edges. And so that's one of the things, these edge effects we think could be very important. Also, we're losing a number of our pollinators and seed dispersers, and that could be important given the biology of these species. And it's important to emphasize that this involves, I wouldn't know, I could see Laurance here later, but maybe 200 species of trees, I'm just not sure. A lot, we're talking a lot of species. Lianas are also increasing. Lianas, of course, are woody vines that climb up trees and are structural parasites of trees. Trees that have lianas tend to have slower growth, less fecundity, less reproduction, and faster or more rapid, more rapid mortality occurring just generally. So you don't want to have a lot of lianas if you're a tree, and you can see here, this is the proportion of plots, the proportion of successional trees in the plots, and these are our edge and the disturbed fragment sites out here with lots and lots of successional trees, and those sites also have lots of lianas. So again, this syndrome of sort of hyper disturbance that we're seeing is hitting the forest kind of in the neck across a variety of different ways. Lianas actually reduce forest biomass. As I mentioned, the trees just don't like lianas at all. The lianas are important structural parasites, so you probably get less tree growth and more tree mortality in areas where there's high liana infestations, and that leads to less biomass, which means there's less carbon storage, which means there's more carbon being emitted to the atmosphere, which we don't want, Okay, so this is part of the degradation process that contributes to this widespread fluxes of carbon into the atmosphere coming from tropical forests. Now, the final thing, we talked about the first two, changes in forest architecture, changes in forest floristics. Now we're going to talk about carbon dynamics, and that sort of segues it naturally because we were just talking about that with our Laurance. So, one of the things that we really see that's striking in the fragments is that there's a big increase in tree mortality. A lot of the trees, especially within about 100 meters or 200 meters of the forest edges, die as a result of the things that we talked about before, microclimatic stresses and wind shear. So what we see is a substantial loss of biomass, of living biomass, in these forest fragments. And that, again, would be contributing emissions to the atmosphere. So why is that happening? Well, one of the things, of course, is this big influx of big increase in tree mortality. But another thing that's happening is not only are a lot of trees dying in the fragments, but a lot of the trees that are dying are the big trees. And this is really important because the massive trees contain a very large amount of the carbon in forests. And you can see this here. Here's the mortality increase in the rainforest fragments relative to the intact forest. Here's our small trees going on up, medium, large trees here. Here's the increase in mortality rates. Every size that we look at here comes in about 100% increase, except for this one. The biggest trees, almost a 200% increase in mortality rates. That's really striking and it'd be very important in terms of the forest ecology and carbon storage. Why? There's various reasons. We could talk about it later if you want, but we have several different hypotheses on that one. And another thing that's happening, so we're getting more mortality and we're getting losses of many large trees, but we're also, the thing that's happening is that the trees that are proliferating in their place, the woody vines, the lianas, and the small trees, tend to be pioneer type species or fast growing species that have low wood density. And because they have low wood density, that means they have low carbon storage. So because of that, they're doing a poor job of storing carbon and keeping it in the forest. More and more of that carbon is being emitted. So all of these factors, the high rates of mortality, the losses of many large trees, and the fact that a lot of the smaller trees coming in have low wood density, all are contributing to this loss of biomass in rainforest fragments. We see a big increase in wood debris and litter on the ground. That's not surprising. Trees are dying all the time, snapping, breaking, that sort of thing. So you can see, but as you get closer and closer to the forest edge, real substantial increase in coarse woody debris, as it's called, all through the forest. Clearly indicates that there's a restructuring of the whole forest in terms of how it's sort of shaping. And another thing that happens as a result of this is an interaction with the outside disturbance from cattle ranchers, which like to burn their pastures. Many of these fragments are surrounded by cattle pastures. The ranchers like to burn their pastures every year. And they do that to provide a flush of green grass for the cattle and also to help control the weeds, which they don't want. So what happens is those fires will oftentimes just come right up against the edge of the forest edge. There's already a lot of woody debris and flammable stuff and litter all down on the ground there. So it hits that forest fragment and it just keeps on burning. And these species are not adapted. These plant species are not adapted for fires, not like Australian species. These things cannot handle fire. So you can see this happening right here. Here's fire frequency in Thailandia, Brazil. This is over a 14-year period, and what you can see here is the average frequency of fires as we're getting closer and closer to forest edges. And you can see here, within maybe 1,000 meters of the edges, suddenly we're getting this zoom, this big increase in forest fire frequency. And this really is one of the key things that is destroying many rainforest fragments. Now, in addition, and we're getting pretty close to finishing up here, in addition to thinking about forest fragmentation, we have been confronted with what seems like almost a reality. And the reality is that there appears to be other phenomena going on that are affecting the fragments. And those, of course, are global change phenomena, which in this sense could be both global change phenomena, like changing temperature, for instance. There might also be regional change phenomena, like across South America, there might be major shifts in weather patterns, that type of thing. So we're talking fairly broadly about large-scale phenomena, but not just ones that are strictly global. So we had a paper in 2004 in Nature where we showed that tree communities in the intact forest, now these are not forests that are supposed to be changing, right? These are supposed to be the intact, structurally fine forests. And yet we found that there were not just changes, but concerted changes. When we looked across our study area, we saw that the forests in intact rainforests were changing in a similar way in many cases. And we published this in Nature, and it got a fair bit of attention, some criticism. But the bottom line is that the results that we got, which is a general shift in tree communities whereby big, fast-growing species that tend to be up in the canopy tend to be becoming ever more dominant, and smaller, shade-tolerant species that are not so fast-growing and don't seem to be able to adapt to rising CO2 levels very well, are declining. So all of this is consistent with what's called the CO2 fertilization hypothesis. Now, when we talk about global change and global warming, I've asked people, I said, well, is this considered part of global change? Absolutely it is. So this is sort of like talking about global warming, but what we're talking about is the shifts in the chemistry of the atmosphere, which is, of course, have gone from about 280 parts per million of CO2 40, 50 years ago on up to 410, 420 parts per million right now. So plants respond to rising CO2 in particular ways, and species that are large and dominant and out in the full sun and can use that increasing CO2 and accelerate their metabolic rates and their growth in response to it appear to be advantaged, and others that are not designed to do that or don't have the physiological machinery to do that are really struggling. So we're seeing changes, but in the intact forest, not in the fragments. More global change. In a couple papers in ecology, we showed that the liana communities are changing. In fact, even if you go into the intact forest, and you can see right here, here's the abundances of lianas in our plots in 1997 and 1999, that period right there. And here's the exact same plots, but sampled in 2012. And that line, black line right there, is the line that those points would all be on if there hadn't been any change. Okay, that would be zero change, everything would be the same. But you can see that almost all of those data points are above the black line, meaning there's more lianas in 2012 than there were in 1997. So this is something that we saw consistently across all of our sites. And again, it's very much consistent with what we would probably expect from the CO2 fertilization hypothesis, but there could be other things happening as well. And yet one more, it's just clear when we look at these fragmented systems that there is a likelihood, or very much a possibility, that more is happening than what meets our eye, that there is a lot of environmental change happening and operating over different spatial scales, and that those changes appear to be operating in concert in some cases and causing a lot of changes. So we're seeing things like increasing lianas, forest dynamics accelerating, faster growing species broadly favored, slower growing species broadly declining. And I think the key point is this. Increasingly, in the world in which we live, we probably are not going to have the simple luxury of studying an ecological system and just studying that system on the ground in front of us and not worrying about anything external to that system. There's probably too many changes and happening in such a wide variety of ways that they really can alter and disrupt systems in some important way. So that's just a little suggestion, to at least something to consider in the future. And the bottom line is, I think that when we're talking about fragmented ecosystems and altered ecosystems on the planet, we do probably need to be thinking considerably more broadly than we have been in the past. Thank you. Okay. I think we'll have to give you the mic because people can't hear you, I think. I'm multitasking, but not that much.
Thank you very much for that. That was very informative. What I was wondering about, so do you think that the rainforest now in Brazil is getting towards a tipping point of changing, so it's going to be markedly different? And what do you think that's going to entail?
Yeah, that's a very topical question, absolutely. There's been a lot of discussion about that. A few years ago, Tom Lovejoy, the guy whose photo I showed, and another guy named Carlos Nobre, who's a famous Brazilian ecologist, got together and basically wrote a paper about the tipping point in the Amazon basin. And I think that sort of focused people's attention. People have been talking about it for years, you know. The bottom line is this. There are studies now, for instance, there was a study came out a year or two ago that showed increasing stress in forests there, and they were using satellite data to look at where stress had increased or decreased across the basin. And it was really pervasive how much stress, forest stress was increasing in different ways that they measured it. And they said, look, this is the system that's getting more affected by global change and could be affected. Now, how much forest can be destroyed? Lovejoy and Nobre said 30% could be destroyed, which right now we're about 20%. I think that figure is more debated, and it depends, a lot depends on things like what's the spatial configuration, where's the location of where forest destruction is going to occur. Because the Amazon's an interesting system in that the water that comes into the system comes from the ocean, but it then goes into the rainforest and then it gets recycled. And they worked out now that it gets recycled like 6 times the average droplet of water while it's heading towards the Andes across the basin. So you got a system here where it's generating a lot of its own rainfall, and that's really important, you know, to its survival, really. So we have to pay attention to these things. Yeah.
Check online.
Benny? No, and you're not the first person who's asked that. We should do that, Penny. But no, we have not redone that, and it needs to be done. It's on my list.